next speaker is a dear friend and Nash from Electronic Frontier Foundation. Nash is the Associate Director of Community Organizing. Him and the team at EFF take care of partners like us at the Electronic Frontier Alliance, where Electronic Frontier Alliance is a group of civil rights and privacy advocate organizations that have come under the EFF banner. The other gentlemen that I want to mention is Louis and Rory, because they do amazing work on a day-to-day basis. And you guys are a pleasure to work with, Nash. So thank you so much. We're looking forward to hearing from you, and keep up the great work at EFF.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure, and absolutely, I can't applaud yourself and Louis and Rory loudly enough. All right. So again, thank you so much for the warm introduction, Vahid, and really thank you to everyone for joining us to discuss big tech and government surveillance. I imagine that a lot of the folks that are tuning in today are probably aware of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but for anyone who may not be, EFF is a 30-year-old nonprofit organization, and our mission is to defend digital privacy, free expression, and innovation. And that means the freedom for inventors to develop new tools and people to have real control of the things that they own, and the freedom for people to associate and express themselves to who they want, to when they want, and to really anyone who will listen without fear of government or corporate surveillance. And there are a few ways that we go about doing that. Our legal team uses the courts to fight for better legal protections and eviscerate bad law. Our activism team that I'm a member of works with our 35,000 members to advocate for policies that protect people from surveillance and non-consensual data collection. And in addition to providing technical analysis to our legal and activism teams, our technologists develop tools that empower users to protect their own privacy, providing real protections where existing legal protections are not sufficient. So as the Associate Director of Community Organizing, as Vahid mentioned, I lead EFF's support of the Electronic Frontier Alliance, and commonly referred to as the EFA. And the EFA is a network of, right now, 80 grassroots groups, which are community groups, student groups in 25 states around the US, and including Ethics and Tech, which was our wonderful host this evening, and Oakland Privacy, another Bay Area-based member of the Electronic Frontier Alliance. And while all of these groups are really autonomous, and so they're not beholden to any EFF positions, they all have their own autonomy to work on things that are right for their own communities, we do kind of coalesce around 5 core principles, which are free expression, security, privacy, creativity, and access to knowledge. And as I'm sure folks can see how all of these are connected very, very intimately to the idea of corporate and government surveillance and really protecting each other and ourselves and our communities from those ills. One of the government and corporate partnerships that my colleagues at EFF have been challenging and building public awareness of over the last few years is Amazon Ring's contracts with more than, I'm going to say this number slowly because it's mind-boggling, with more than 2,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. And in fact, 2 years ago, we issued an open invitation to Ring spokesperson Shaquille O'Neal to meet with us to discuss the privacy, safety, and civil liberties concerns presented by Ring and their partnerships with law enforcement agencies.
Awesome, I can be anywhere and see who comes to my door.
Look at that, Shaq. The whole backyard, you can see that.
Look at that, that's nice.
That's beautiful.
All right, Shaq, I see you and Jamie. Hold up. You've been busted.
Of a growing partnership between police and the popular doorbell company Ring is raising privacy concerns nationwide.
Police departments can now use an app to access footage uploaded by Ring users.
The company says its goal is to eventually have every law enforcement agency in the country on its police portal.
Shaq, we're challenging you to a one-on-one. All right, so if we win, Ring has to stop partnering with law enforcement.
What happens if we lose?
Come sit down with us one-on-one and hear how these law enforcement partnerships with Ring are threatening Americans' rights.
People buy these thinking they're just buying a camera, but really, they're selling their own privacy. With one click, police can request footage from any Ring camera. And even if you refuse, they can go directly to Amazon with a warrant and obtain footage from your door.
It's not just your privacy, it's your friends and your neighbors' privacy too. Don't forget, your neighbor's Ring camera is pointing at your house.
Shaq, EFF has been fighting the surveillance state since you were at Louisiana State. We know how technologies like Ring can harm our communities. If we wanted help learning how to dunk, we'd come to you. If you want to learn how ubiquitous surveillance puts us all in danger, you should come to us. We'll be waiting.
Probably not surprisingly, Shaq never did RSVP. But a few weeks ago, we did uncover that just as we'd warned, police, in this case the LAPD, were acquiring access to Ring data in order to monitor protests against police violence. And documents we received through public records requests confirmed that the LAPD had sent requests to Amazon Ring users specifically targeting footage of last summer's Black-led protests against police violence. And that said, LAPD is certainly not alone in over-surveilling protest activity. Later this evening, you're going to hear from my colleague, Saira Hussein, about EFF's investigation and lawsuit regarding the San Francisco Police Department's use of the Union Square Business Improvement District's network of over 400 cameras to spy on protests under the guise of public safety and situational awareness. Now, this all raises the question of what can communities do to stop the spread of unwarranted surveillance? When it comes to corporations, it's important to remember that each of you, as the consumers or possibly stockholders, has power. Your decision to boycott or divest has a direct impact on their bottom line. Amazon's decision to press pause on the sale of face recognition technology to law enforcement came just as much, if not possibly more, as a result of consumer and stockholder pressure as it did to political pressure. And when it comes to police department access to these systems, Oakland, Berkeley, Davis, Santa Clara County, and municipalities across the country have already passed legislation that requires transparency before a government agency can utilize a surveillance network like this. In fact, it's San Francisco's own community control of police surveillance ordinance that provided the framework for us to hold the SFPD accountable for accessing a private network of surveillance cameras without Board of Supervisors approval or any publicly available use policy. And so controller police service surveillance regulations have been passed in more than a dozen municipalities across the country as part of a campaign we launched in partnership with EFA member Oakland Privacy and national partners, including the ACLU, SALT, NAACP, Movement for Justice, the National Network for Arab Communities, and others. What was different about San Francisco CCOP's ordinance was simply that it added a ban on one particularly pernicious form of surveillance being face surveillance. And with that exception, which has been retroactively added to some of the earlier ordinances, CCOPS doesn't say that government agencies can't acquire types of surveillance. Instead, it just creates a democratic process for providing transparency and accountability measures that shift the power away from agency executives and into the hands of elected officials and the communities that they answer to under some very basic guiding principles. First, that surveillance technology should not be funded, acquired, or used without express city council approval. All too often and frequently with funds acquired through Department of Homeland Security grants or through Department of Defense gifting, we see that there's often not an awareness or input from any community residents or even elected officials. And local communities should play a significant and meaningful role in determining if and how surveillance technologies are funded, acquired, or used. So rather than allowing the police or other agencies to decide that unilaterally, CCOPS ordinances put the responsibility in the hands of elected officials after they've heard from their constituents and the communities that they're accountable to. And the process for considering the use of surveillance technologies needs to be transparent and well-informed. So those reports need to speak to the capabilities, how it's going to be used, how the data will be preserved, how long it's going to be retained for, and how potential adverse impacts on civil rights and civil liberties are going to be mitigated or prevented. And another guiding principle of CCOPS ordinances is that, much like warrants, the use of surveillance technologies should not be approved generally. So if they are provided, approval should be specific for technologies and specific limited uses. To assure that agencies remain in compliance, CCOPS ordinances also require that agencies issue reports on an annual or biannual basis, because without this, a public approval process would be of significantly limited value. So they create an opportunity to modify the use policies if it turns out that what was adopted is not sufficient. And finally, really bringing it full circle, the history of unwarranted surveillance of activists and historically marginalized communities requires that CCOPS, and CCOPS really recognizes that surveillance technology should not be funded, acquired, or used without addressing those impacts and the civil rights and civil liberties concerns. Because we know that from the COINTELPRO era, or the the monitoring of the American Indian movement and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and even to the recent CBP and Department of Defense and U.S. Marshal's Office monitoring of protests against the police murder of Black people here in the United States, government surveillance has had a significant detrimental impact on movements for civil rights and civil liberties. So in recognition of that, these community control over police surveillance ordinances require that prior to holding a public hearing, the police or other agencies seeking to acquire new surveillance technologies should expressly identify the potentially adverse impacts the technology may have on residents' civil rights and their civil liberties, and what specific measures they'll undertake to prevent those adverse impacts. Now, I want to be really clear-headed here that we will not and we cannot regulate away all of the harms of violent, biased policing in collaboration with corporate surveillance. But as we reimagine the future of public safety and protecting essential freedoms, these types of ordinances, the CCOPS ordinances, provide an important step, taking the surveillance of our communities out of secluded rooms and placing critical information and accountability within our communities and into the hands of our community members and the lawmakers elected to represent them. So as we continue to, in closing, really what I'll say is that, as we continue to consider what are the ways that we can be fighting, these different types of surveillance, we should really be thinking about if we're concerned about where the power is lying now, we really should be considering where should the power be lying, and really putting that power back into the hands of our community members and creating democratic processes for deciding what is appropriate for our communities and what is not appropriate for our communities, rather than leaving it in the hands of folks who are currently empowered, right? And so one of the last pieces that I'll actually close out with that I think was understated in what I've shared so far is that it's really important to make sure that there is something called a private right of action, so that individuals within the community, and with fee shifting, so that individuals within the community can enforce. They don't need to prove that they've been personally harmed, because a lot of times with surveillance technology, it's impossible to prove that you've been personally harmed. But with the private right of action, you don't need to prove that you've been harmed. You need to just prove that the ordinance has been violated. And fee shifting makes it easier for folks not to have to worry about the EFF and the ACLUs and wealthy individuals supporting them, but any member of the community can find someone to represent them, because an attorney, understanding and having faith that their client will prevail, will know that they will be compensated once they're able to prove that the ordinance has been violated. So again, thanks again for your time. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And again, my colleague Saira Hussein will be speaking later on and kind of speaking a little bit more about how we've actually moved into enforcing this in San Francisco.
Wonderful, Nash. The ring technology scares the Jesus out of me. Nothing that good comes out of Amazon. It seems that the surveillance and the level of monitoring, not just from their vans, but from each of the ring cameras, really invades our privacy, and it needs to be looked at. And unfortunately, their work with the police departments is pretty scary by itself. I want to also, in finishing up, I want to make sure that we thank you guys again for all the work that you do, Nash, at EFF. We're a huge fan and a supporter, and whatever we can do to support you guys in your endeavors, we're here for you.